Dan Rather. Honored to have him here on the Rich Eisen Show. How are you, Dan?
Rich, doing great. Great to be with you.
Honored, and again, honored to have you here. So you called play-by-play of University of Houston football?
I did. I've always been in news, but as you well know, making your way in radio in the early years, you scratch for every dollar you can get. And I did University of Houston football, basketball, baseball, even called a track meet once. Track meets are really tough to do play, I'll tell you. But that was in Houston when I was in Houston, 1956 to 1960. I was the so-called voice of the Cougars, as in the University of Houston Cougars.
So who would you be before we get into obviously this documentary and other matters? Who was I guess the sports broadcaster that maybe as you were climbing up the ladder in your career that you might have emulated while you took to the mic as a sports broadcaster?
Well, there was a guy named Kern Tips who was the voice of Southwest Conference football. The old Southwest Conference had, University of Texas, A&M, Rice, SMU, TCU. And when I was growing up, Kern Tips, I can still hear his voice in the hall of my memories, Huey Keeney is back in deep punt formation to the Owls, back to the kicking chores. I sort of emulated him. Bill Stern, who was a very famous sports broadcaster at the time on a national level, we got him at Houston. Houston was a pretty remote location during those days. So, but Kern Tips was my play-by-play guy. I used to listen to him and try to emulate him.
Dan Rather joining me here on the Rich Eisen Show, the narrator for tonight's Timeline, Lombardi's Redskins, 8 Eastern on NFL Network. Well, what about the Lombardi Redskins do you think needs to be brought out the most that folks might not know about, Dan?
Well, first of all, I think that I'm very proud of this documentary. The NFL film folks did a terrific job with this. But I think people who were not of memory age at the time or people who were not alive at the time may not recall that Lombardi had the great years in Green Bay, really established the National Football League as kind of a national pastime at Green Bay. But he made the mistake of his professional life by retiring as coach at Green Bay and spent a year as general manager. He was miserable being general manager. He came to Washington, a famous attorney named Edward Bennett Williams, who owned the Redskins, brought him to Washington. And it wasn't just that Lombardi turned the Redskins around. The Washington Redskins had 14, count them, 14 straight losing seasons. Lombardi came in 1969. He brought discipline to the team. He even managed to discipline the now Hall of Famer Sonny Jurgensen, one of the best passers the game has ever known, but a guy not known for discipline. So in football terms, he turned a terrible franchise completely around. He did it by discipline. But more importantly, he became he was already a national figure, but he became a very important person politically and sociologically for the country. Among the reasons is that Lombardi was way ahead of his time. He was very tolerant about race. He was very tolerant on gender issues, lifestyle issues. He played at least 2 gay players when nobody else in football would do so or admit doing so. With Lombardi, if you could play his way, a very disciplined, detail-oriented kind of coaching way, he didn't care if you were green or what you did in your private life. And this was well ahead of his time. Second thing, I think many people don't know is that at least 3, maybe 4 of Lombardi's players on his team were members of the National Guard, and they weren't able to practice much during the week, sometimes didn't practice at all during the week. As you remember, the 60s were a tumultuous time. There were protests in Washington, riots in the streets some of the time. And these guys were in the National Guard, so they had to serve in the National Guard, including sleeping in the barracks. So they couldn't practice during the week. They just showed up on Sunday. The third thing people may not know is that Lombardi became such a national icon in his time that Richard Nixon, who ran for president and won in 1968, had considered putting Vince Lombardi on the ticket as his vice presidential candidate. I'm not sure Lombardi would have taken it had it been offered, because while Lombardi was a Republican, his wife was a staunch Democrat. But those are among the things I think people may not know. The biggest thing is that how Lombardi was bigger than football. He was huge in football, but he was bigger than football because of the way he addressed these racial issues and gender issues.
Dan Rather joining me here on the Rich Eisen Show. So there really was a possibility of a Nixon Lombardi ticket in the '68 election, Dan?
Yes, that President Nixon talked about it, and he talked about it. We now know this. We didn't know it at the time. There are tapes of the period, and Lombardi had made such an impact in Washington when he came there and turned the Redskins around that President Nixon talked about it again. Well, maybe said Nixon when he ran in 1972, he was thinking about, maybe Lombardi would be good on the ticket. But, of course, Lombardi died of cancer. He only had the one season in Washington.
Right.
After that season, my own opinion is there's no documentation on this. I think Lombardi knew that he was very ill, the one season he had in Washington. But what the official record shows is he had that season, turned the Redskins around, and then before the next season started, he was diagnosed with colon cancer, and he never coached again.
So is it a true story that you had season tickets to this '69 season while you were the White House correspondent for Nixon's first year in the White House for CBS and going to these games on the weekends?
That's true. When I came back from Vietnam in 1966, I became a Redskin ticket holder. I have two children, a daughter and a son, and both of them were avid Redskin fans, so I bought season tickets. And yes, I was in the stands in 1969 when President Nixon became the first president to attend an NFL game. And, Rich, this may interest you, that you go back and take a look at the pictures, and the President of the United States sat in the stands. The old RFK Stadium didn't have many boxes. And you can't imagine a president today going to a football game, and it's very common for presidents to go these days. Nixon was the first to go. When he went, he sat in the stands. I won't say like everybody else, but he was not upstairs in a box anywhere. You won't see that again with any American president.
Did Richard Nixon think he could draw up plays? I mean, I know he would be what he would call George Allen, right? But did he really think he had a coordinator's sense ability, Dan?
He did. He had what we all have, Rich. We're all coaches at heart, football fans. And Nixon would draw these plays, which he thought were original plays. For example, he'd draw a play with a slant pattern and say, this is a secret play, and he'd try to pass it along to George Allen, who succeeded Lombardi later as coach of the Redskins. And everybody in town, because he was president, everybody had too much respect to laugh in his face, would kind of laugh and say, oh, well, I wish somebody would tell the president this is not a secret play. This play's been around since Trigger was a colt.
Fantastic. That's fantastic. And I guess it had, as you just mentioned, Dan, that obviously you thought maybe Lombardi knew he was ill before the rest of the world did. What would have happened if Lombardi had not passed away and had stayed in Washington, D.C.? For 7-5 and 2 was his record that one year. What do you think how that would have affected the entirety of the Redskins organization, even to this day?
Well, keep in mind that I'm still a Redskins fan.
Yes.
And I am convinced, and I'll go to my own grave believing, that if Lombardi had not gotten ill, he would have gone to the Super Bowl within 2 or 3 seasons. I actually think he might have made the Super Bowl the next year. Remember, he had Sonny Jurgensen, one of the great passers of all time, and particularly a good deep passer. He could do the vertical throws extremely well. Lombardi had the makings. He had turned the team around, and he had the makings of a future champion. And given his past record, yes, I think he would have gone to the Super Bowl within the next 2 or 3 years had he not died after that first season.
So are you sitting down on Sundays and checking out Kirk Cousins and the rest of the crew, Dan, more often than not?
Absolutely. I'm surprised by Kirk Cousins, very pleasantly surprised. Who knew that Kirk Cousins could be as good as he is? They have their problems. They have some defensive problems, and they don't have as good an offensive line as I think they ought to have. I don't see them as Super Bowl material anytime in the next couple of years, but they'll be competitive.
Now, because people obviously associate you with the Lone Star State, Dan. I mean, is this a problem with any members of your family that you become a Redskins fan and the Cowboys are who they are at all?
Well, as a matter of fact, the answer is yes. Because I'm a Texan, I'm not just from Texas, I'm of Texas. Mm-hmm. And in the early years of the Cowboys, they were the only professional team within 1,000 miles, and we all cheered for the Redskins, up for the Cowboys, and Dandy Don Meredith, their quarterback star of the '60s, became a hero. But once I got to Washington, and my kids, who were very young, and didn't have both of them were born in Texas, but they didn't have the cowboy gene. When they started pulling for the Redskins, I started pulling for the Redskins, and now, yes, with my friends and family in Texas, they give me a hard time, and on days when the Redskins manage to beat the Cowboys, it's kind of frosty around here.
Well, Dan, I'm honored, as I mentioned, to have you on this show. In the summer of O.J.'s preliminary trial in 1994, I was your intern at the CBS Evening News, and
You're kidding.
I'm not joking. You could not have been nicer, and you were busy. You were on that set pretty much about 10, 12 hours a day. I was the one fielding the calls from people in Wisconsin saying, "Don't worry, the Price is Right, or your soap opera will be back on the air shortly." But
I love it. I love it, Rich. Well, I'm glad to see one of our boys made it.
Well, I just want to know, in terms of your entire career, I mean, the perforations on your script were freshly cornered, correct? I mean, in terms of your scripts, that was the best it's ever been in your career, right? That summer.
Absolutely. The scripts couldn't have been turned down better.
And thanks again for being part of something with the NFL Network. All of us at the NFL Media Group are honored for that, too. So I look forward to it.
Rich, thank you for having me on today. I hope we can talk again somewhere along the line, and I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
You and me both. Thank you so much. That's Dan Rather, at Dan Rather on Twitter.
The Rich Eisen Show, weekdays at noon Eastern on Audience.